Marley Hayes never imagined she would spend a brisk February evening hunched over her worn suitcase in a modest hotel room, face flushed with confusion and the distant hum of city traffic mingling with her own panicked heartbeat. She had arrived in town just that morning, believing she was simply here for a short business trip on behalf of the small charity she worked for. Her boss, a stern but kind-hearted woman named Deborah, had insisted Marley represent them at the Valentine's charity gala, an event rumored to be graced by numerous wealthy donors, including a reclusive billionaire known only as Mr. Blackwell. Marley hadn't paid much attention to the rumor. She was too busy worrying about the presentation she planned to give in hopes of securing sponsorship for the charity's after-school program. Yet all of that paled in comparison to the predicament she now found herself in. Several hours earlier, moments after she checked into the hotel, a letter was waiting at the front desk, a thick envelope bearing her full name in graceful, looping handwriting she did not recognize. When she'd opened it, her heart nearly stopped. Tucked inside was an official marriage certificate, the date on it only a week old. The certificate listed Marley Hayes as one spouse, and someone called Ethan Blackwell as the other. Staring at the paper, Marley fought the urge to laugh out loud. It seemed like an outlandish prank, something a mischievous friend might orchestrate, except she couldn't think of anyone in her circle with the power or inclination to forge a legal document quite this convincingly. The certificate bore all the hallmarks of legitimacy, a watermark, a county clerk's raised seal, and two careful signatures at the bottom. Her own name was scrawled there with the same swirling flourish she used for her official ID, as if she'd signed it in a hurry but had still tried to make it look neat. She remembered the name Ethan Blackwell from the local rumor mill. He was supposedly a withdrawn billionaire whose main corporate headquarters was set in a gleaming tower downtown. If the incessant gossip was to be believed, he was either a ruthless mogul who broke deals without remorse or a somber philanthropist who donated millions anonymously, depending on who was telling the tale. Marley had never encountered him personally, but the city's tabloids ran stories every so often about how he avoided public events, let alone intimate entanglements. The notion that she, an unassuming charity representative, had married this elusive figure was too absurd to process. Yet every detail on that certificate screamed authenticity. She tried to piece together the events of the past week, searching for a memory gap. She'd been overwhelmed with the chaotic fundraiser back home, scurrying from place to place to gather donations. There were no drunken nights in Vegas or wild parties on her calendar. She'd spent most evenings drafting funding proposals, not stepping foot into any wedding chapel. Marley racked her brain for a scenario in which she might have somehow, in the midst of delirious exhaustion, signed a marriage license with a complete stranger. It made zero sense. She had never laid eyes on Ethan Blackwell, as far as she knew. That alone reduced her to pacing the threadbare carpet, arms folded tight across her chest. Complicating matters further, a second sheet accompanied the certificate, an embossed invitation to the Valentine's charity gala that very night. It was lavish and formal, addressed to Mrs. Marley Hayes Blackwell. The swirling script suggested an event of high prestige. This invitation, like the certificate, appeared legitimate. A note in smaller print requested her presence at the Grandview Hotel's rooftop ballroom, stating that Mr. Blackwell would also be in attendance. Marley felt her stomach clench as she realized the significance of the location. She was, in fact, staying at the Grandview Hotel for her own presentation scheduled the following day. Had Deborah unknowingly sent her straight to the same place her so-called husband would be? Marley tried calling her boss, almost wishing Deborah would laugh and say it was all a dramatic prank for publicity. But Deborah sounded just as shocked, and Marley read out the certificate's text. Despite sounding baffled, her boss advised Marley to investigate discreetly, cautioning that any scandal might tarnish the charity's reputation. The phone call ended on a note of worried encouragement: just be careful. And if you really think something suspicious happened, call the police. Yet Marley couldn't picture going to the police with the story that she had apparently married a billionaire in her sleep. No, it was too ludicrous. As evening approached, Marley found herself repeatedly glancing at the clock on the bedside table. She recalled that the charity portion of the Valentine's Gala would commence around 7 p.m., with the most influential attendees arriving fashionably late. The invitation had said that Ethan Blackwell planned to make an appearance. A part of her wanted to avoid him altogether, to vanish from the premises and treat this entire fiasco as a forgery. But her job demanded she be at that gala to network, and if the certificate was real, avoiding him wouldn't solve anything. Some small, persistent voice in her mind insisted that she needed answers. Moreover, if their names were linked on a legal document, perhaps he had some explanation for how it came to be. Maybe it was a case of identity confusion or someone forging their signatures for reasons unknown. Marley tried to steady her nerves by dressing in a simple yet elegant navy blue gown. She'd packed it for her presentation tomorrow, intending it to be a professional outfit for meeting potential donors. Now it would serve as her evening attire at the gala. As she pinned up her dark hair, she practiced lines in the mirror. "I'm sorry, but there must be a mistake," or, "Mr. Blackwell, do I know you?" Nothing sounded right. Her reflection showed a woman trying too hard to appear calm. The hum of the city nightlife grew louder as 7 p.m. drew near. Marley perched on the edge of the bed, swallowing her trepidation in small gulps. She finally slipped the marriage certificate into a slim folder, intending to keep it in her handbag as undeniable proof of her confusion. If Ethan Blackwell turned out to be someone else entirely or refused to see her, she could still show the papers to a hotel staff member or an event coordinator in hopes of gleaning more information. But deep down, she sensed that only he could shed light on what was really going on. At last, she forced herself to stand and head for the door. The corridor leading to the elevator seemed unnaturally long, her footsteps echoing as if mocking her reluctance. Once in the elevator, she pressed the button for the rooftop level, and her heart fluttered with anxious anticipation. For the first time in her life, Marley was stepping into a realm of high society and multi-million-dollar philanthropy with a nagging possibility that she was, in fact, a billionaire's wife, somehow, without her knowledge or conscious participation. The elevator's gentle hum did little to soothe her swirling thoughts. As she neared the top floor, the faint strains of orchestral music reached her ears. Then the doors parted with a chime, revealing a lavish corridor glowing with crystal chandeliers and lined with marble planters filled with vibrant pink roses. A sign welcomed guests to the Valentine's Charity Gala, gold lettering on a white board. Marley took a breath, clutched her folder, and stepped forward, each stride feeling both surreal and momentous. Tonight, she would either uncover a bizarre truth or walk away convinced she was the victim of an elaborate hoax. In the back of her mind, the realization that the date was Valentine's Day only heightened the strangeness of the entire scenario. If fate had a sense of humor, it was certainly playing its biggest joke now. Marley stepped into the ballroom and found herself momentarily overwhelmed by the grandeur. In place of the stark elevator hall, she was greeted by a vast space adorned with gilded mirrors, towering floral arrangements, and velvet drapes in shades of deep crimson. The muffled strains of a string quartet drifted from somewhere near the center of the room, and clusters of people in elegant evening attire filled the space with a low hum of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. Everything glittered in the soft glow of ornate chandeliers, each crystal prism reflecting Valentine's hues onto the polished marble floor. She paused for a moment at the entrance, collecting her breath and scanning the crowd. For all her nerves, she had an obligation to represent the charity that had entrusted her with this trip. Still, she couldn't stop her gaze from straying toward every tall, dark-haired figure in a tuxedo, wondering if one of them might be Ethan Blackwell, the man whose name appeared beside hers on that unsettling certificate. The flutter of fear and curiosity made her heart pound. Smoothing her navy blue gown, she approached the check-in table, where a courteous attendant offered a warm smile and handed her a small name tag on a sleek lanyard. It bore her name and the logo of the Valentine's Charity Gala, but did not mention a second surname or her supposed husband. Marley took a quiet breath of relief. At least there was no immediate scene to alert everyone to her predicament. Her plan, tenuous as it was, hinged on gathering information before doing anything rash. She reasoned that Ethan Blackwell, if he truly existed and was indeed her mysterious spouse, would appear eventually. Rumor had it that he rarely made public appearances, but all the whispers in philanthropic circles suggested that tonight would be the exception. The hush of speculation echoed in snippets of conversation around her. "They say he's a recluse," one woman in a champagne-colored dress confided, "but he's definitely coming for a major announcement." Another older gentleman in a crisp black suit murmured that he'd heard Mr. Blackwell intended to double his usual donations, though he wasn't sure why. Marley listened intently, gleaning what she could while making her way through the crowd, uncertain whether to wish she could remain anonymous or to hope she stumbled into the man she was supposed to find. She soon spotted a group from her own organization, Deborah's acquaintances, mostly, standing near a lavish dessert display. A wave of relief washed over her at the familiar faces, and she wove across the parquet floor to greet them. They welcomed her with enthusiasm, offering brief introductions to other potential donors and urging her to discuss their after-school program. For the next several minutes, Marley forced herself to set aside the confusion about her possible marriage and focus on her mission, securing funds and awareness for the children who desperately needed resources. She smiled through each handshake, accepted compliments on her gown, and earnestly pitched the value of the charity's programs. Even so, a constant tension lingered in her chest. Behind each polite exchange, she was on the lookout for any sign of an aloof billionaire. A half-hour later, a soft chime signaled that the evening's formal presentation would begin soon. Attendees drifted toward the far side of the room, where a small stage had been set up in front of a sweeping window offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Marley found a spot among a cluster of other charity representatives, the folder with her secret certificate still tucked under her arm. She scanned the stage, where a microphone stood patiently waiting for the first speaker. Several prominent figures in local philanthropy took their places in the front row. Cameras flashed as photographers angled for the best shots. Apparently, this event was a headline grabber for society columns, though Valentine's-themed galas were often overshadowed by more neutral philanthropic events. Tonight, however, the tension was palpable, as if everyone expected a big reveal or major news. Marley's skin prickled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. In the corner of her eye, she noticed a side door open, admitting a small group of people. One was a stoic older man who gave off the air of a personal advisor or legal counsel. Another, a stylish woman in a sleek black dress, might have been an assistant or event planner. Between them walked a tall figure in a tailored suit, broad-shouldered and exuding a quiet sense of command. Though his face was partially turned away, something about his posture, the confident way he surveyed the room, made Marley's pulse spike. She couldn't be certain from the glimpse alone, but a whisper in the back of her mind insisted that he was the one she had dreaded and longed to see. Her grip on the folder tightened, and she swallowed hard. Just then, a master of ceremonies, a jovial man in a bow tie, stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," he began, voice echoing amid the tall ceilings and glittering decor. "On behalf of the Valentine's Charity Gala organizers, welcome. We are so grateful to each and every one of you for spending this heartfelt evening with us. Your generosity will go a long way in supporting numerous worthy causes throughout the year. Tonight, we have a very special lineup of speakers and an even more special surprise." A mild ripple of interest swept through the crowd. Marley glanced at the group by the side door and felt her throat go dry. The man she suspected to be Ethan Blackwell stepped forward slightly, exchanging words with the older advisor at his side. She yearned to slip through the crowd, approach him, and thrust the baffling marriage papers in his hand. Yet caution prevailed. If he truly was who she thought, confronting him publicly could explode into a scene she wanted to avoid. The MC carried on, introducing the first speaker from a renowned children's hospital. Marley forced herself to listen politely, though she couldn't repress the sense that every word of the speech floated past her ears without truly landing. Her attention was locked on the side stage area, where the imposing figure in the impeccable suit now stood quietly, arms folded, scanning the audience with a distant gaze. She saw him tilt his head as if searching for someone. Was he scanning for her? The possibility sent a shiver of apprehension up her spine. Had he discovered her presence or learned about the letter? Or was he simply fulfilling a public appearance requirement and had no idea that the woman he was apparently married to was standing just yards away, heart pounding? In the midst of the speech about the hospital's initiatives, another hush swept the crowd. People parted slightly, making way for the tall man as he moved discreetly closer to the stage. The MC concluded his introduction, then added in a bright tone, "And now we have the pleasure of welcoming a seldom seen but always generous guest. Please join me in a round of applause for Mr. Ethan Blackwell, whose contributions to this event, and indeed to our city, cannot be overstated." Marley's breath caught. If there was any doubt remaining, it vanished when the MC said that name with absolute clarity. Ethan Blackwell, her alleged husband, stepped onto the small stage, nodding curtly at the crowd's applause. Despite the polite smile he offered, there was a guarded quality in his eyes, as though he wasn't fully comfortable in the spotlight. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment he took the microphone. His voice, deep but measured, thanked the donors for their support. He spoke with a calm efficiency, describing the philanthropic goals of the gala, his hope for bettering the lives of children, and the importance of continuing these efforts year-round, not just on Valentine's Day. There was nothing particularly theatrical in his approach, no flamboyant gestures or self-aggrandizing remarks. If anything, he seemed determined to keep attention off himself, focusing on the charities at hand. Yet Marley couldn't look away. Every word he spoke resonated with sincerity, and for all the rumors of his reclusive nature, he carried himself with a certain kindness. The man she had half expected to be a forbidding presence was instead quietly passionate, especially when describing how certain children's programs had personally touched him. The crowd seemed charmed by his authenticity, applauding warmly. Still, none of this explained how she had supposedly become his wife. There must have been a mistake, a forged document, or some bizarre arrangement she knew nothing about. As he concluded his remarks, Ethan glanced over the crowd again. His gaze swept past her, paused for a heartbeat, then slid away. Had he recognized her? Marley's heart pounded so fiercely she feared people around her might hear it. She wanted to step forward, call out his name, and demand answers. But she was rooted in place, torn between the impulse to remain invisible and the urgent need for the truth. Applause surged as he stepped back from the microphone, handing it off to the MC. Ethan nodded politely, then disappeared behind the thick velvet curtain to the side of the stage. Marley exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Go talk to him," hissed a voice beside her. It was a fellow staffer from her charity, looking excited. "He's obviously the biggest donor here, right? This could be our chance to secure more funding." The staffer had no idea about Marley's real dilemma, only that she was responsible for forging beneficial connections tonight. Marley forced a smile and mumbled something noncommittal. She needed a moment to think. Approaching Ethan under the guise of a fundraising pitch might give her a reason to speak privately, but how was she supposed to casually mention a marriage certificate in the same breath as a children's arts program? Slipping away from her coworker, she maneuvered around the periphery of the ballroom. The lavish decor and couples swirling on the dance floor felt surreal, as if she was trapped in a dream half-warped by longing and dread. She glimpsed an exit sign near the stage's side corridor. Perhaps that corridor led backstage, or at least somewhere close to where Ethan might be retreating. Taking a breath, she decided to seize her nerve. She clutched the folder containing the certificate and moved purposefully toward that exit. If anyone questioned her, she could claim she was looking for a staff lounge or a quiet room to finalize some charity forms. She hoped no one would test her story too stringently. Sure enough, the short corridor beyond the door was less ornate, revealing the practical side of the hotel with gray walls and simple signage. Soft chatter echoed from a nearby room. Marley inched closer, pressing herself against the cool surface of the wall to avoid attention. Through a partly open door, she could see Ethan standing with the older man in the dark suit who had accompanied him. The conversation was low but intense, though she couldn't make out the exact words. Feeling guilty for eavesdropping, she debated turning back. Yet her desire for clarity was too strong. If only she could overhear something that might clue her in on what was happening. Ethan shook his head at something the older man said, then ran a hand through his hair, tension evident in the set of his shoulders. He looked like a man caught between two unwelcome choices. Marley spotted the faintest lines of fatigue or worry etched into his brow. Her heart twisted unexpectedly. Despite the swirl of confusion around this supposed marriage, she felt a pang of compassion. She had come here anticipating a cold, distant figure or a cunning billionaire who had orchestrated some manipulative scheme. Seeing him up close, more human and evidently burdened by something, made her pause. At that moment, as if sensing her presence, he glanced toward the open doorway. Their gazes collided. She froze, folder clutched against her chest. A flicker of surprise flashed across his face, followed by something else, recognition, perhaps. He murmured a brief phrase to the older man, who nodded and stepped away. Then Ethan moved toward the doorway, arms at his sides, expression guarded. Marley's throat felt dry, but she forced words out. "Mr. Blackwell," she managed, voice nearly a whisper. I'm sorry to intrude, but I need to speak with you. Urgently." He regarded her, eyes narrowing slightly, as though he couldn't place her. Yet there was no outright dismissal. "Of course," he said after a moment. His voice was calm but carried the same undercurrent of tension she'd heard when he addressed the crowd. "Should we step somewhere more private?" Marley swallowed, nodding. This was it. The moment she had spent hours dreading. She glanced around and noticed an empty side lounge with the door half ajar. Without another word, Ethan led her inside, quietly shutting the door behind them. The lounge was unoccupied, small but well appointed with a leather sofa, a bar cabinet, and soft lamplight that gave the room a warm glow. The distant sound of music still permeated the walls, a muted reminder that the gala continued on the other side. Trembling slightly, Marley drew the folder from under her arm. "I found this waiting for me when I checked into the hotel." She opened it to reveal the marriage certificate, pressing her hand over the text as she mustered the nerve to continue. "According to this, she had to stop and steady herself. "It says I'm married to you." Ethan's gaze flicked down to the document. For a second, he appeared as stunned as she had been. He took a slow breath, then reached out. With careful fingers, he lifted the certificate from her grasp and studied it. In the hush, Marley could almost feel her heartbeat echo. She watched his eyes scan the details, her name, his name, the date, and noticed the flicker of something unspoken in his expression. Regret? Confusion? Recognition? "This date," he said quietly, voice strained. "It's from last week." He looked up. His words faltered, as though he was recalling something he wished not to speak aloud. Then he refocused on her. "Where did you get this, and why does it have your name next to mine?" Marley's cheeks burned. "It was left for me at the hotel front desk with a note saying I'd need it tonight. I have no idea who delivered it. But it sure looks authentic, and you can see my signature at the bottom. Only, I don't remember signing anything, let alone meeting you. So I don't know how it came to be." She exhaled shakily, trying to keep her voice from cracking. Ethan went silent for a long moment, scanning her face as if trying to decide if she was telling the truth. Then he nodded, like something clicked in his mind. "I believe you," he said at last. "This is no ordinary forgery. The seal and the clerk's signature are legitimate. Yet I have no memory of wedding vows either." His tone tightened slightly. "Are you certain you've never met me before tonight?" She closed her eyes briefly, mustering honesty. "Not to my knowledge. Unless we crossed paths unknowingly. But the idea that we ended up legally bound feels impossible." She managed a half-laugh laced with anxiety. But apparently, the impossible is happening. He lowered the certificate, his jaw set in a determined line. Something is obviously amiss. This isn't the way I conduct my life, and I doubt it is yours. Which means there must be a reason someone orchestrated this. He paused, turning the paper over as though searching for a clue. Or maybe something else is at play, maybe we truly did sign these under bizarre circumstances. But that's improbable, to say the least. Marley's pulse quickened. The notion that they might have both been manipulated sent a chill through her. Could someone want to tie me to you for money? Or maybe to create a scandal? It's hard to imagine how or why. Hard to say without more information, he conceded softly. Look, Ms. Hayes, Marley, he spoke her first name carefully, as though testing the feel of it. I'm sorry you've been put in this situation. I promise you, I'll do everything I can to uncover the truth. If this document is real, we'll handle the legalities. If it's a forgery, we'll expose whoever's behind it. Relief and uncertainty mingled in Marley's chest. She hadn't expected him to be so calm, nor so cooperative. Part of her had feared he'd accuse her of scheming. But there he stood, earnest and quietly intense, agreeing to help her unravel this strange marriage claim. The weight of her earlier apprehension lifted, replaced by a new sort of tension, the unsettling awareness that she felt unexpectedly drawn to the complicated man in front of her, as though the forced connection in that piece of paper wasn't the only reason her heart hammered. If you need me to sign anything, Marley ventured, to clarify that I'm not trying to claim anything from you or. He shook his head firmly. Let's not jump to disclaimers just yet. There's too much we don't know. But we should stay in contact. I'd like to have my legal team verify everything and do some quiet research into how your name ended up next to mine. A faint flicker of a wry grin touched his lips. In the meantime, let me at least introduce myself properly. I'm Ethan Blackwell, and it's nice, albeit bizarre, to meet my alleged wife. Marley gave a soft laugh that trembled at the edges. Marley Hayes. Alleged wife, yes. Nice to meet you too. His gaze lingered on her face, as though he was committing every detail to memory. Then, gently, he folded the document and handed it back to her. Hold on to that. We might need the original evidence. Tomorrow, after the event ends, I'd like to speak with you more in depth, assuming you'll still be in town. She nodded, explaining she was here for a few days for the charity presentations. I'm staying at the Grandview, same as you, I assume. He looked slightly taken aback, then gave a short nod. Yes. I have a suite upstairs for the duration of the gala. Perfect, then we won't have trouble meeting. A moment passed. The muffled music of the gala drifted into the lounge, reminding them that the world kept spinning outside these four walls. I should get back to the event, he said quietly, or people will begin to wonder where I vanished to. May I escort you back, or would you prefer a more discreet return? Marley glanced at the door. The thought of walking into the crowd at his side, arm in arm, was too surreal. Maybe discreet is better for now, she said. I'm not sure I can handle the questions. He inclined his head. Understood. For a moment, he hovered, an odd tension in his posture. Finally, he murmured, "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I'll be in touch, Marley. We'll figure this out." And with that, he slipped from the lounge, leaving her alone with her swirling emotions and the faint perfume of freshly cut roses that pervaded the hotel's decor. Marley closed her eyes, exhaling a slow, unsteady breath. She felt torn between relief that Ethan Blackwell wasn't hostile or accusatory, and an underlying confusion about what might happen next. The certificate in her hands felt heavier than before, as though now it carried not just her puzzlement but a strange sense of anticipation. She wasn't certain if she believed the story they were concocting, that maybe it was all a ploy or a forced arrangement by unknown actors. Yet for the first time since discovering that shocking piece of mail, she felt a small glimmer of hope that the truth, whatever it might be, could unite her and Ethan in understanding rather than cast them as enemies. Before leaving the lounge, she smoothed her dress, steadied her breathing, and resolved to see the night through. She had her charity's interests to uphold, after all. If people noticed she looked a little more flushed than before, they would attribute it to the busy swirl of the event. Little did they know she was quietly carrying the strangest secret in the room, that she might already be a billionaire's wife. Tomorrow would bring new revelations and, Marley suspected, even more questions. But for now, she returned to the gleaming ballroom with a heart caught between dread and an odd flutter of excitement, waiting for the next piece of this unlikely puzzle to reveal itself. Marley hardly slept that night, her mind a carousel of unanswered questions and lingering adrenaline. Each time she closed her eyes, she replayed the moment she and Ethan stood in the lounge, both gazing down at the marriage certificate that claimed they were husband and wife. She recalled the look in his eyes, a mixture of bafflement and resolve, when he promised they would get to the bottom of this. Now, in the silence of her modest hotel room, she wrestled with the same sense of unreality. How could a simple trip to a Valentine's gala have entangled her in a puzzle that defied all logic? Morning arrived all too soon, with a watery winter sun streaming through the thin curtains. Despite the restless night, Marley forced herself out of bed and readied for the obligations that awaited her. The charity's official presentation was scheduled for midday in one of the hotel's conference suites, and she would need her full concentration to impress potential donors. She repeated her usual routine of showering, dressing, and rehearsing bullet points about the after-school program's impact, yet everything felt overshadowed by the knowledge that at some point, she would speak to Ethan again, away from the public eye, to confront the bizarre possibility of their unremembered wedding. As she made her way downstairs, she found the hotel's central lobby already bustling with guests. Some carried gift bags, others hurried off to morning meetings. Winding through the throng, she arrived at the conference area, where Deborah's voice carried over the hum of chatter. Spotting Marley, Deborah broke away from a small group and approached, worry etched in her features. She didn't greet Marley with her usual no-nonsense enthusiasm. Instead, she placed a hand on Marley's arm, leaning in to speak quietly. "Did you manage to learn anything last night?" Deborah asked, glancing around as though concerned about eavesdroppers. "You look a bit pale, dear. I assume you spoke to Mr. Blackwell. Or at least encountered him." Marley nodded, wishing for even a shred of certainty to ease her boss's concern. "I did talk to him, but it was brief. Neither of us knows how that certificate came into existence, or at least that's what he says," she replied softly. "He wants to investigate further." His reaction was, surprisingly calm. She resisted the urge to divulge too many details. No need to alarm Deborah with the full scope of her confusion, especially given how precarious the charity's funding prospects were. "We agreed to have a more thorough conversation today. He believes there may be a legal angle or some orchestrated hoax. I'm not sure yet." Deborah's brow knitted as she processed this. "Well, whatever you do, keep your wits about you," she said firmly. "I know it's not ideal, but if Mr. Blackwell's as philanthropic as rumor suggests, and if you two can maintain civility, we might walk away from this fiasco with the donations we need. Just remember your priorities. Our goal is to secure the funding for the kids. If at any point you feel uncomfortable, I'm here." Grateful for that reassurance, Marley mustered a small smile and promised to stay cautious. Then she joined her colleagues, who busied themselves setting up the display boards and informational brochures about their programs. The next hour and a half flew by in a swirl of handshakes, polite conversation, and pitch after pitch about the importance of literacy in arts education for underprivileged children. It was the kind of work Marley usually loved, rallying support for a cause that mattered deeply. Yet her mind couldn't stop flicking back to the hidden drama playing out behind her professional veneer. About midway through the morning, someone from the hotel staff handed Marley a discreet note, sealed in a slim envelope. Her heart skipped as she recognized the flowing script on the front. She excused herself from the group, stepping behind a tall display to open it. The message was concise: meet me in Suite 1928 at your earliest convenience. E.B. There was no elaborate flourish, no explanation, just a time and place. So he was staying on the 19th floor. Marley inhaled, trying to quell a new wave of nerves. Perhaps Ethan had discovered something overnight, or maybe he simply wanted to proceed with verifying the certificate. Either way, the invitation felt oddly intimate. Her session with potential donors wrapped up just before noon, leaving her with a narrow window before the next round of presentations. Trying to appear unhurried, Marley slipped away from the conference area and headed to the nearest bank of elevators. She pressed the button for the 19th floor, telling herself that if this meeting resolved at least one or two mysteries, she could finish the rest of her day without the weight of confusion pressing on her chest. The elevator ride was a silent countdown, each floor's passing indicated by a subdued ding. She clutched the folder again, containing not only the marriage certificate but also her notes from last night's conversation. Upon reaching the 19th floor, she stepped out into a plush corridor lined with muted sconces and thick carpeting that absorbed the sound of her footsteps. Following the numbering on the doors, she soon came upon Suite 1928. She raised her hand to knock but hesitated, the memories of their strange first meeting crowding her mind. Finally, drawing a steadying breath, she rapped her knuckles quietly. The door opened almost immediately, revealing Ethan in shirt sleeves and a loosely knotted tie, as though he'd been in the midst of business calls. Seeing him out of the formal tux and in a more relaxed state made him seem less distant, more tangible. A flicker of relief flitted across his features, and he motioned for her to enter. The suite was spacious, a corner unit with large windows framing a panorama of the city skyline. A sleek, modern desk sat beside the windows, scattered with papers and what looked like legal documents. Marley spotted a small table set with coffee and pastries, presumably courtesy of the hotel's hospitality services. "Thank you for coming," Ethan said, gesturing for her to sit on a comfortable armchair by the window. He closed the door gently behind her, then retrieved a second chair for himself. Once they were both settled, he pressed his palms together, leaning forward in an earnest posture. "I've been combing through everything I could find. My attorney has also spent the morning verifying the county records. The certificate is indeed registered in Nevada. Legally binding, pending any attempt by us to nullify it." Marley's eyes widened. She'd hoped for a revelation that this was an obvious forgery, but apparently not. "So it's actually on file with the county clerk's office?" She felt her heart plummet, stunned anew by how thoroughly her life had turned upside down. He nodded, mouth set in a grim line. "I'm afraid so. Which means if we do want to disclaim it, we'd have to go through an annulment process. Normally that's straightforward, but there's one snag: the clerk's record also shows a signed affidavit of no impairment, meaning we each allegedly confirmed we were of sound mind when we entered into the union. That complicates matters slightly, legally speaking." She set the folder in her lap, trying to quell the wave of incredulity. "But neither of us recalls giving such an affidavit or physically being in Nevada. This is insane. Could someone have impersonated us? Or drugged us?" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I've considered impersonation, though forging signatures well enough to pass clerk scrutiny is an elaborate effort. And the presence of your actual signature is perplexing. Last night, I studied it extensively. It matches the style of your signature on your driver's license, which I found in some public records after we parted ways." Seeing her startled expression, he offered a quick reassurance: "I asked my legal team to confirm you were who you said you were. I meant no invasion of privacy, but you can understand my caution." She swallowed, recognizing he was simply covering his bases. "I get it. I've been verifying your identity too, in a sense." So we're both equally baffled. Her gaze drifted to the table stacked with papers. "Have you uncovered anything else?" Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "Not much. One odd detail stands out: We apparently stayed in a luxury hotel suite in Nevada under the name Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell for exactly one night, after which we both checked out. The staff there has no memory of us fighting or looking coerced, no red flags. Their records show a late check-in and early check-out. It's as if we arrived, signed the documents, and left with no fuss. The security cameras for that date are mysteriously unavailable, claimed to be corrupted, which may or may not be a coincidence. Marley's pulse raced at the idea that they had been in the same room, a scenario neither of them recalled. It was like hearing about two other people living a parallel life. She tried to piece it together logically, but every theory sounded far-fetched. Were they victims of an elaborate scam? Did someone slip them something to ensure compliance? Why would a random third party go to such lengths, unless they aimed to extort or manipulate Ethan's wealth? None of it answered the basic question of why her specifically. Seeing her distress, Ethan softened his tone. We'll figure out the motive. It could be blackmail, or a business rival wanting to create scandal, or something else entirely. In any case, I've put my private investigators on high alert. We'll get to the truth soon. Marley nodded, though doubt still gnawed at her. And in the meantime? People think you're single, and my boss certainly thinks I'm single. My entire charity is hoping you'll help us. And there's that possibility that if this becomes public, it could overshadow everything else, like the kids who need funding. She paused, pressing her lips together before adding, plus, I'm not exactly comfortable going about my day as though I'm not legally married to a stranger. A faint smile ghosted across his features, more rueful than amused. I can't blame you. Nor am I eager to walk around with a hidden wife. But I also don't want to rush an annulment if there's a deeper ploy. I worry that revealing we suspect foul play might tip off whoever's orchestrating this. Marley considered that logic, even as it made her stomach tighten. So we keep it quiet for now. Pretend we're not married while you investigate. The notion felt surreal. But if we're legally bound, there might be repercussions if we do anything major, like you can't legally marry someone else, or I can't. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a moment. I'm not exactly in a rush to marry anyone else, he murmured. Still, you're right about the legal limbo. Let's aim for a private resolution soon. Until then, you can continue your work, and I'll keep you updated. He gestured at the suite around them, a thoughtful look in his eyes. I'll remain in the city for a few days, finalizing philanthropic commitments. We can meet again to discuss developments. If you're comfortable, I'd also like to get to know you better, if only to see if we can recall any missing details together. Maybe something will jog a memory. Her heart thumped at the personal note in his voice. She reminded herself this was hardly a romantic scenario. Yet the idea of spending time with him outside the swirl of a formal gala or clandestine lounge conversation didn't strike her as entirely unpleasant. She set her folder aside, meeting his gaze directly. I suppose that makes sense, she said. Given the situation, we need all the clues we can find. If that means you and I having a coffee or dinner, comparing notes, I can handle that. He stood, running a hand along the back of his neck in a gesture that betrayed a flicker of nerves. Thank you. And to be clear, I'm grateful you're approaching this rationally. I realize the shock of discovering you might be my wife can't be easy, especially when it affects your reputation and your charity's prospects. I promise I won't do anything to jeopardize your standing. My lawyers can draft a confidential agreement ensuring you're protected in the event of media leaks. He paused, turning away slightly to retrieve a small slip of paper from the table. This is my personal number. Call if anything odd happens, or if you recall something important. She took the paper, noting his neat handwriting. I appreciate that. I'll keep you informed if I receive any more mysterious envelopes or if a memory resurfaces. She rose from her chair, brushing invisible dust from her skirt. The sense of awkwardness settled between them again, a pair of relative strangers poised on the brink of an unexpected alliance. I should head back to the conference area. My organization's next presentation is soon. Ethan nodded, his posture shifting into something a bit more formal. Of course. If the schedule allows, I'll attend. Might as well see where my money could be going, right? The corner of his lips curved in a faint smile, and for the first time Marley glimpsed a hint of warmth beneath his controlled exterior. She let out a small laugh, tension lifting slightly. We'd welcome your support, obviously. I'll look for you afterward. Gathering her folder, she started for the door. Just before opening it, she glanced back. His gaze was still fixed on her, a mix of concern and curiosity in his eyes. Something in that look made her heart constrict, and she quickly turned the handle, stepping back into the hallway where the plush carpeting muffled her steps. As she descended in the elevator, Marley replayed their conversation, half disbelieving how easily they had slipped into a sort of partnership. Not that the situation was normal, nothing about a presumed marriage to a billionaire could be normal, but at least they were approaching it together. She had expected him to be aloof, or arrogant, or to cast blame on her. Yet he had been patient, even considerate. Though she still wanted answers, at least she didn't feel alone in seeking them. She returned to the lower levels, re-entering the bustle of the charity function with a renewed sense of purpose. If the day went well, she might secure more donors for her cause and glean a deeper understanding of who Ethan Blackwell was, beyond the swirling rumors and her own wild speculation. Maybe, just maybe, by nightfall they would each recall a clue from the missing days that might explain how they ended up husband and wife in the eyes of the law. Until then, Marley braced herself for the half-known truth: her life would not revert to simplicity anytime soon, and the more she uncovered about Ethan, the more she suspected that the path ahead might lead to revelations neither of them had anticipated. Revelations that could transform them from accidental partners to something else entirely. Marley's charity presentation concluded with polite applause and a cluster of interested donors lingering to ask questions. She handled each inquiry with as much poise as she could muster, mentally reciting the facts about budget allocations, the after-school arts curriculum, and the measurable outcomes of the program. Yet despite her genuine passion for the cause, her thoughts kept drifting to the slip of paper in her pocket, Ethan's personal number, and the conversation they'd shared that morning. Every so often, she scanned the crowd, half hoping to glimpse him among the suits and pencil skirts, but the only new face she recognized was a local councilman who had once visited the charity's main office. It occurred to her that Ethan might have slipped in discreetly and remained at the back. Then again, he might have decided it wasn't wise to show up, worried about the attention it could draw. Still, her presentation wrapped up smoothly, and Deborah gave a small nod of approval from the far side of the room. Marley found herself with a short break before the next set of panel discussions, so she ducked outside the conference hall and into a quieter alcove. The hum of chatter from the corridor grew softer, and she leaned against the wall, exhaling. She pulled out her phone and tapped out a brief message to Ethan, letting him know the presentation had ended and that she would be free for a short while if he wanted an update. She hesitated before hitting send, questioning whether she was being too forward. But given the surreal nature of their predicament, clarity felt more important than caution. She pressed the button and slipped the phone back into her bag, swallowing a twinge of anxiety. To her surprise, her phone vibrated almost immediately. The screen displayed Ethan's name, or rather the placeholder she had input, Ethan. Since she still struggled to think of him as simply Ethan. She read the message: "I'm in the lobby. Meet me by the south exit if you're available. I'd like to show you something." The brevity of his note gave nothing away, leaving her to wonder what he might have uncovered. Heart fluttering, she composed herself and wove through the flow of attendees until she reached the lobby's soaring arches. The south exit opened onto a glass-enclosed walkway that overlooked an ornamental garden, its manicured hedges and stately marble fountains contrasting with the modern lines of the hotel. Ethan stood near a tall window, the skyline behind him washed in midday light. He wore a crisp blazer over a dark shirt, his posture confident yet slightly tense, as though he was bracing for a conversation that could shift everything they knew. When Marley approached, he offered a faint smile and motioned toward a quieter nook by the glass. She couldn't help noticing the curious glances cast their way, likely recognizing Ethan Blackwell, or at least sensing his importance. Still, no one approached to intrude. Once they were somewhat secluded, he reached into the leather portfolio he held under his arm and extracted a small sheaf of papers. "I had an interesting call from a contact in Nevada," he began softly, lowering his voice so it wouldn't carry in the echoing space. "It appears someone checked us into a suite at a high-end resort on the day that certificate was filed. The person at the front desk remembered a woman with dark hair wearing a gray coat, possibly you, but she also mentioned that the woman seemed nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder as though expecting to see someone else. That doesn't ring a bell for you, does it?" Marley frowned, trying to recall her wardrobes of late, but she had no specific memory of wearing a gray coat in Nevada. "I do have a gray coat," she admitted, "but that hardly proves I was there. Could be pure coincidence or someone who resembles me. If I truly was in Nevada, I'm certain I would remember a trip like that. My schedule has been jam-packed with charity events. There's no gap large enough for me to have flown there and back unnoticed. And I definitely would have told someone if I'd traveled to another state, no matter how hectic." She hesitated. "Unless I was drugged or coerced, but that sounds far-fetched." Ethan exhaled, glancing over the typed notes in his hand. "I agree it's improbable. Yet all evidence points to us physically being at that resort. And the staff member's story feels genuine, she didn't seem like she was lying or paid off. But if you truly don't remember, then we can't rely on her testimony alone." He flipped a page, scanning it. "Also, there's a name that cropped up, Arena Green. She apparently accompanied us to the suite, acting like some sort of liaison. The clerk remembered her introducing herself as a friend. Any connection to you?" Marley shook her head, the name completely unfamiliar. "None. I don't have a friend or colleague with that name." The puzzle deepened. If this Raina Green was involved, perhaps she was part of whatever orchestrated plan had placed Marley and Ethan in that suite, forcing them to sign documents. Or had she been the one to lead them willingly into something they both forgot? The notion sent a chill skittering down Marley's spine. Could Raina be the culprit behind all this? "I'm not ruling it out," Ethan replied. "My team is trying to track her down now, though she left no credit card or ID that the resort recorded. She might not even be who she claimed." Silence fell between them, thick with the weight of unanswered questions. Outside, a row of taxis pulled up to the curb, and a breeze rustled through the ornamental shrubs. After a moment, Ethan set the notes aside, fixing Marley with an apologetic look. "I'm sorry if it feels like you're caught in a net. I'd hoped for clearer leads, but each discovery raises more questions. The only silver lining is that, at least so far, no one's tried to blackmail either of us. That might mean the plot is more convoluted, or maybe the real motive hasn't surfaced yet." Marley gazed through the glass at the courtyard, the meticulously trimmed hedges reminding her of the neat life she once led before this fiasco. If no one's demanded money, maybe it isn't blackmail. Could it be some personal vendetta? Or a twisted joke? She thought of all the random individuals she'd encountered in the philanthropic sphere, but none who would go to such extremes. "I just don't see who would benefit from us being legally wed without our knowledge." Ethan rubbed his temples, the tension clear in his voice. "I keep circling back to a competitor in business, or some estranged family member of mine who thinks they can manipulate me. It wouldn't be the first time someone tried to manipulate a high-profile figure with a scandal. As for you, you represent a decent philanthropic cause, so maybe they assumed it would create public sympathy or confusion. But that's just speculation." Lowering his hand, he studied her face. "In the meantime, we're stuck in this uncertain arrangement. I don't want to push you to continue a public pretense, but it may be wise for us not to disclaim it publicly until we see if someone emerges to exploit the situation." Marley thought of the eyes flicking toward them even now, passers-by in the lobby who could sense an undercurrent of tension. So we keep our interactions quiet. Let everyone assume I'm just another charity rep talking to a potential donor. That's simple enough. But, there's another event tonight, a follow-up gathering from the Valentine's Gala, right? If we both attend, we'll inevitably run into each other in front of people. He nodded, an unusual hint of ruefulness crossing his features. We could minimize attention by not arriving together or standing too close. Though I confess, the idea of ignoring you entirely feels counter to my nature. I prefer directness. But I'll respect your boundaries. His candor left her simultaneously relieved and unsettled. A swirl of conflicting emotions formed in her chest, curiosity about who he truly was beyond the polite front, uncertainty about how to act around him, and a strange sense of camaraderie that bloomed from sharing this bizarre secret. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. "I'll be at the post-gala cocktail hour for a while. If something new comes up, you can discreetly let me know." He started to speak, then paused, his gaze dropping to the phone in her hand. "And if anything suspicious happens, text or call me. Even if it's the middle of the night." There was protectiveness in his tone, surprising her. Maybe he sensed her vulnerability in a way that extended beyond casual concern. Marley promised she would. They lingered for another moment, neither moving, as though both were reluctant to end the conversation. She found herself noticing the subtle lines of weariness around his eyes and realized that for all his resources, Ethan was as caught in this confusion as she was. The final clue to the puzzle, who orchestrated their wedding, and why, might require more cooperation, more trust, than either of them had ever expected to invest in a near stranger. At length, they parted ways with a quiet exchange of goodbyes and a mutual vow to keep each other informed. Marley returned to the hustle and bustle of the conference, her mind only half on the presentations that followed. Though she managed to secure a few promising donor leads for the charity, every achievement felt overshadowed by the deeper mysteries swirling around her. By evening, as she prepared for the cocktail hour, her reflection in the mirror showed a resolute face she scarcely recognized, a woman determined to wrest truth from an impossible situation. The memory of Ethan's sincere gaze stayed with her, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this search for answers, and that perhaps the strangest bond of all could prove to be their shared determination to uncover the truth that had thrust them together under the most improbable of circumstances. Marley stood in front of the hotel suite's mirror that evening, smoothing the satin bodice of her cocktail dress and reminding herself to keep her expression calm. Her heart felt like a restless bird beating at the cage of her ribcage, torn between the duties she had to her charity and the secret she shared with Ethan. After the day's hectic schedule of panels and donor meetings, she was supposed to be winding down, a typical post-event routine. Instead, her evening promised another layer of tension, the Valentine's follow-up cocktail hour, where a smaller, more exclusive crowd would mingle to discuss potential collaborations. A glance at her phone told her the cocktail hour had already begun downstairs. She inhaled slowly, practicing a neutral smile in the mirror. The reflection that met her gaze looked poised, but she could see the flicker of nerves in her eyes. She was still grappling with the knowledge that her name sat on a legally recognized marriage certificate beside Ethan Blackwell's. Through the conversation they'd shared in the lobby corridor, they at least had a framework for investigating the matter together. Yet the more they unraveled, the more complicated it seemed. Someone had created a scenario that forced them into an unremembered wedding, and neither had a firm lead as to why. Stepping into the hallway, she took the elevator back to the hotel's main reception area, where staff directed her to a smaller lounge behind the grand ballroom. As she neared, the subdued sound of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the gentle strains of a live pianist drifted into the corridor. Two attendants in matching burgundy suits opened the doors, and she entered a warmly lit space that felt intimate yet upscale, soft amber lighting highlighting a gleaming parquet floor, comfortable chairs grouped around low tables, and a small bar along one wall where uniformed bartenders calmly tended to requests. Unlike the larger gala, which had been open to a broader set of guests, tonight's crowd seemed more selective, high-profile donors and select charity representatives, each invited by the Valentine's Committee for deeper networking. Marley swept her gaze around, catching glimpses of Deborah engrossed in discussion with a pair of philanthropic moguls, while another coworker chatted quietly with someone wearing a diamond-studded name tag. No sign of Ethan yet. She wasn't sure if she felt relief or disappointment. Keeping her folder pressed discreetly under her arm, she still carried the marriage certificate, just in case. She navigated the clusters of small talk, exchanging greetings and polite conversation. Most people recognized her from the day's event, praising the clarity of her presentation on the after-school program. She forced a gracious smile, fielding their comments while half of her mind roamed the room, on the lookout for a tall figure in a tailored suit. At one point, she paused beside a small arrangement of hors d'oeuvres, nibbling on a delicate pastry to ease her rising nerves, when she spotted him across the lounge. Ethan stood near the bar, engaged in conversation with a slender woman in a midnight blue gown. His posture was polished, one hand resting lightly on the back of the bar stool, the other clasping a glass of sparkling water. Even from a distance, Marley sensed the tension in his shoulders. His manner was polite, but there was something guarded about his expression. When the woman laughed softly, resting her fingertips on Ethan's forearm, a tiny jolt of an unidentifiable emotion sparked in Marley's chest. Jealousy? No, that was ridiculous. She had no claim to him, no real basis for resentment, especially considering how little they understood about this involuntary bond. Swallowing her unease, she decided not to approach them immediately. Instead, she moved closer to Deborah, who appeared to be wrapping up her conversation with a potential sponsor. Marley. Deborah murmured, beaming as Marley came into earshot. I was just telling Mr. and Mrs. Van Allen about your success in the donor lounge this morning. They're very interested in what you've accomplished with limited resources. Marley offered them a courteous smile and launched into an explanation of how the charity prioritized funding to keep administrative costs low, ensuring the majority went to direct program support. It was second nature to discuss these details, and for a time she almost forgot about the swirl of personal issues. Yet from the corner of her eye, she could see Ethan and the woman in the midnight blue gown part ways with a polite handshake. He turned slightly, scanning the room, until his gaze landed on Marley. She felt a subtle jolt, as though they were caught in a private moment in a space full of watchers. Politely concluding her conversation with the Van Allens, Marley stepped away from Deborah and crossed the lounge. Ethan excused himself from another cluster of guests, meeting her near a tall vase overflowing with red roses. For an instant, they said nothing, overshadowed by the glow of the accent lights and the rhythmic music from the pianist. Then he inclined his head in greeting, carefully cordial in case anyone happened to observe. You made it, he murmured, voice subdued. I wasn't sure if you'd skip this part for some well-needed rest. She managed a small smile. I need to be here for the charity's sake, just like you said, we can't appear to be running from anything. Besides, Deborah is counting on me to solidify any potential leads. She let her gaze linger on him. I saw you talking to that woman at the bar. Another potential donor? He glanced over his shoulder. Yes, a minor sponsor from last year's fundraiser. She was inquiring about why I've been so preoccupied. A wry note colored his tone. I told her I have a lot on my mind. Nothing untrue, but not the entire truth either. They shared a moment of silence, acknowledging how surreal it was to dance around the subject of their legal entanglement while mingling with unsuspecting acquaintances. Then Marley cleared her throat. Did your investigators find anything more about Raina Green or the hotel in Nevada? She asked softly. Or is there any movement at all? Ethan shook his head, frustration flickering across his features. Nothing substantial. It's as though Raina Green vanished from the face of the earth after that date. No official ID, no credit card statements, no known address. She might be using an alias. My team is thorough, but it could take time. And in the meantime, the clerk who remembered you or your lookalike can't confirm details beyond saying you appeared uneasy. Marley huffed a small sigh. It's maddening. If I was there, why can't I recall it? She leaned in a fraction closer, lowering her voice so the music and chatter would mask their discussion. Ethan, do you think someone drugged us or orchestrated some temporary memory loss? I know it sounds like the stuff of crime dramas, but I can't fathom how else we'd forget an entire day. He studied her for a moment. Before this, I would have called it paranoid speculation. Now, I'm not so sure. We do have that suspicious gap in security footage. It's possible. He paused, swallowing as though the admission cost him. I've asked my personal physician if any compound could erase short-term memory. He mentioned certain sedatives or hypnotic drugs might cause blackouts, but it's unusual to have both people blacked out yet functioning enough to sign forms. We can't rule out an elaborate con. But we lack direct evidence. Her skin prickled at the thought. I hate feeling powerless, she murmured. The not knowing is worse than the possibility we were used. He nodded gravely, then offered a quick look around the lounge. Shall we find someplace quieter? I know an alcove off the courtyard that's usually empty at this hour. Marley's pulse fluttered at the prospect of slipping away with him again, but she recognized that they did need privacy to speak freely. Sure, she said quietly. Lead the way. They skirted the edges of the cocktail hour, deflecting mild attempts from other guests to rope them into conversation, until they found themselves stepping out through a side door into a sheltered courtyard illuminated by tall sconces. The hush of the night enveloped them, no other souls braved the February chill in this area, leaving the crisp air scented with a faint trace of winter leaves. A single stone bench sat near a small fountain that gurgled softly. The scene was unexpectedly romantic, stirring a fresh wave of nerves in Marley's chest. Ethan paused beside the fountain, resting one hand on the low stone wall. Above them, a star or two glimmered through the city's light pollution. I appreciate your willingness to discuss all this in the middle of your event obligations, he began. I know you have responsibilities, and I don't want to overshadow them. If at any point you want to walk away from this investigation, I'll understand. Marley swallowed, the gentle splash of water filling the pause. I can't just walk away, she said, meeting his gaze head-on. I need answers as much as you do. And until we resolve this marriage license, my entire life could be in limbo. What if I need to travel or sign important documents and discover this legal status complicates everything? Also, there's my family. My aunt and uncle might have a heart attack if they found out I was secretly married. She let out a mirthless laugh. We're in this together, like it or not. His gaze softened at her earnestness. Very well. I'm determined to keep you updated. If you think of anything from the past few weeks, any weird phone calls, suspicious visitors, please let me know. No details too small. She nodded. I'll check my phone records, see if I missed something. And I'll rummage through the charity's appointment logs in case an unusual name popped up. Perhaps that Raina used a different alias. Who knows? Ethan turned, pacing a few steps along the fountain's edge. The soft lighting accentuated the tension in his posture. After a moment, he stopped, facing her again. One more thing I wanted to mention. My lawyers can expedite an annulment if that's your preference, ignoring the question of who orchestrated it. But that might hamper our ability to discover the larger conspiracy. Once an annulment is filed, it could tip off any culprit that were unraveling their plan. I'm not certain how you feel about waiting. Marley felt a flicker of conflicting impulses. Part of her craved an immediate escape from the absurd situation, so she could return to a normal routine. Another part worried that doing so would leave the real problem unsolved, possibly letting the perpetrator free to strike again. And an oddly insistent voice in her mind asked if she was truly prepared to sever all ties with Ethan, especially after discovering a sense of kinship in their shared confusion. I suppose waiting is the better choice, she said slowly, since we don't want to sabotage the investigation. But I'd be lying if I said it doesn't scare me, continuing in this legal no man's land. He exhaled, crossing the short distance between them. I feel the same, he admitted quietly. But in the short term, we can keep it private. If it ever becomes unmanageable, or if the risk to your charity's reputation grows, we'll reevaluate. He glanced at the fountain's rippling water. I never guessed Valentine's Day week would turn my life upside down like this. I'm sure you didn't either. That drew a genuine, if weary, chuckle from Marley. No, definitely not on my calendar. But I guess we adapt or drown, right? She lowered her voice, letting the hush of the courtyard envelop them. Some part of me wonders, if we do solve it, what next? We go our separate ways, sign the annulment forms, and pretend we never heard of each other. It seems so final. A flash of an indefinable emotion passed through his eyes, there and gone. Maybe. Or maybe we'll have reason not to. Hard to say until we know more. Let's not cross that bridge just yet. Her heart fluttered at the possibilities hinted in that statement, but she quickly refocused. Agreed. They lapsed into a companionable silence, the distant hum of city nightlife drifting over the stone walls. Marley realized how surreal it felt to stand in near solitude with Ethan Blackwell, each of them teetering between frustration at their predicament and a cautious sense of connection. She sensed that if not for the bizarre circumstances forcing them together, they might never have shared more than a polite handshake at a public function. Now, each conversation seemed to draw them deeper into an alliance that transcended simple politeness. Eventually, the crisp air made her shiver slightly, and Ethan noticed, a flicker of concern passing over his face. "We should get back inside," he murmured. "People might question our absence." She nodded. "Right. And Deborah will suspect I'm slacking off." They exchanged a tight smile. "Let's keep each other posted. If you discover anything else tonight, text me. Otherwise, maybe we can meet tomorrow morning, compare notes again." "Done," he said, stepping aside to let her move toward the door. As they walked back into the hotel's warmly lit corridor, the noise of laughter and tinkling glasses returned, reminding them that the world kept spinning outside their hush of secrets. They paused near the door to the main lounge, glancing at each other one last time. Marley mustered a smile that conveyed both gratitude and uncertainty. "Thanks for not ignoring this. Or me." Ethan's returning smile was subtle, tinged with fatigue. "I could never ignore something like this, or you, apparently. Take care, Marley. And let's hope we make progress soon." With that, he slipped back into the gathering throng, his dark hair blending among the elegantly dressed guests. Marley exhaled, pressing a hand to her temple. Another conversation, another set of revelations, yet they were still no closer to the truth. She wove through the crowd to find Deborah, her mind swirling. Tomorrow, she and Ethan would meet again, presumably in private. Would the next clue show up, or would they remain stuck in the puzzle that held them bound by unwelcome vows? All she knew was that with each passing hour, the idea of severing that unexpected bond once and for all felt less straightforward than it had initially seemed. Something about Ethan, a quiet steadiness beneath the tension in his eyes, a flicker of genuine empathy, made the notion of returning to a simple life without him strangely bittersweet. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling surprise of all, that in the midst of an enforced marriage and looming questions, she found herself unexpectedly drawn to the man fate had cast as her husband, if only for the space of this mysterious, confounding Valentine's week. Marley rose early the next morning, the thin winter light barely illuminating her hotel room. She'd slept fitfully yet again, plagued by restless dreams of being lost in a labyrinth of paperwork where Ethan's name and hers were written over and over in looping script. Awaking to the soft buzz of her alarm, she pushed aside the tangled duvet, a firm resolve settling in. Today she and Ethan would have another meeting, one that would hopefully edge them closer to the truth. She had texted him late the previous night to confirm a time, and he proposed breakfast at a small cafe within walking distance of the hotel, somewhere quieter than the hustle of the lobby or conference halls. The idea of meeting him for breakfast carried a distinct sense of intimacy that gnawed at her nerves. But they needed somewhere discreet, and the cafe apparently opened early enough to avoid the mid-morning rush. Rubbing the sleep from her eyes, Marley showered, dressed in comfortable yet polished clothes, and carefully packed the marriage certificate folder in her satchel. She told Deborah she was stepping out for a short while, citing a personal errand and promising to be back in time for the afternoon meetings. Deborah, absorbed in an array of phone calls, merely waved her off and reminded her to stay reachable. Outside, the air was crisp, a faint sun peeking through a grayish sky. Marley made her way down the busy street, the city stirring to life with delivery trucks and early commuters hustling past. She double-checked the address Ethan had messaged, Rosemore Cafe, a modest place known for artisan coffee and fresh pastries. It was the kind of cafe that managed to be welcoming without being cramped, located at the corner of a quieter block edged by bare-limbed trees. Stepping inside, she was greeted by the comforting scent of brewed coffee and toasted bread. Sure enough, Ethan was already there, seated at a small table near the back, away from the window. He wore a dark sweater under a neatly tailored coat, and the subdued morning light that spilled through the front windows cast soft shadows on his face. At her approach, he stood politely, gesturing for her to join him in the seat opposite. There was no sign of the tension from the fancy gala, just two near strangers, albeit one's linked by an unexplainable marriage license. "Good morning," he said quietly, a hint of warmth threading his voice. "I wasn't sure how you take your coffee, so I ordered a black one for you. If that's not your preference, I can adjust." Marley smiled, touched by the considerate gesture. "Black is fine. Thank you." Settling into the chair, she shrugged off her coat and set her satchel on the floor. The cafe was almost empty except for a lone student typing away on a laptop and an older couple quietly reading newspapers. Quiet jazz music played overhead, weaving a cozy atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the confusion swirling inside her. Ethan slid the coffee cup toward her, and she caught a whiff of its rich aroma. "I had one of their croissants," he admitted with a faint grin. "Couldn't resist. Feel free to order something if you like, my treat, of course." Despite the swirl of tension, Marley found herself relaxing marginally at his easy tone. She took a sip, enjoying the warmth that spread through her chest. "I might grab something in a minute," she said. "First, I'm curious if anything else turned up overnight." He inclined his head. "My investigators are still combing through phone records and credit card statements, but so far no fresh leads on Raina Green or any direct sign of a hoax. They did manage to get a partial list of flights for the day we supposedly traveled to Nevada. None of them list either your name or mine. That points further to the idea of identity subterfuge. Someone booked flights under false identities, or we traveled via private means that remain unregistered." He paused, picking at the corner of a napkin. "I know it must be frustrating to hear the same lack of progress. But at least it confirms we're not simply forgetting a normal commercial flight." Marley absorbed this news with a calm she hadn't felt in the first days of the scandal. Perhaps she was getting used to the strangeness. "No flights in our names. That means either we used an alias, or we never physically went. Both scenarios are alarming. And you said the hotel clerk in Nevada insisted it was us who checked in. Maybe she was fooled by lookalikes, or bribed to say so. But forging our signatures to that extent," she trailed off, frowning into her coffee. "It's such a major operation just to force two people into a marriage. Which begs the question, why?" Ethan's gaze flickered with a kind of resigned bafflement. "Exactly. It's an elaborate ruse that yields no immediate payoff. Unless it's a long con, or someone's waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We do have to be cautious. This might be about money, reputation, or something more personal." A waitress approached, offering a menu, and Marley quickly asked for a small pastry and some water. Ethan politely declined, mentioning he'd already eaten a croissant. Once the waitress departed, Marley leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You mentioned you have some business rivals who might relish stirring up scandal. Do you suspect any one of them specifically?" He considered. "I have a few, complicated relationships. But none with an MO that fits this pattern. Typically they target my corporate dealings, not my personal life. I also have distant relatives who occasionally attempt to manipulate the family trust, but forging a marriage license. That's crossing a line that feels extreme, even by cutthroat business standards." Marley smoothed the cuff of her sleeve, thinking hard. "Then maybe it's not about you. Possibly it's about me or the charity. Though I can't fathom who would bother. We're a small organization, though we do handle a moderate influx of donor funds. Could it be a ploy to discredit the charity, sabotage us, or funnel money away? None of that lines up neatly." A pause settled as they exchanged uneasy looks. Outside, a delivery truck rattled past, the clank of its metal doors briefly intruding on the cafe's calm. Ethan let out a slow breath, then offered a slight tilt of his head, a silent suggestion that they pivot the conversation. "For the time being, we might not solve the puzzle in one go. Perhaps we should talk about how you're feeling in all this. We've focused on the investigation, but you're also stuck in a bizarre legal bond." The softness in his tone touched Marley more than she cared to admit. "It's been draining," she confessed, swirling her coffee absently. "My focus should be on the kids in our programs, building donor relationships. But my mind keeps returning to that certificate, or the idea that I was in Nevada without memory." She offered a self-conscious laugh. "And, well, I keep wondering about you, too, who you are beyond the headlines. I guess it's inevitable if we're legally married, even if it's a sham." A flicker of sympathy crossed his face. "I'm sorry you've been so unsettled. If it helps, you're not alone in that feeling. I'm more used to controlling every variable in my business and personal life. Having this sprung on me, with no immediate explanation, is equally disconcerting. But I'm determined to remain calm. Panicking rarely solves complex problems." He paused, swirling the remaining water in his glass. "As for who I am, I suppose we never did have the chance for a proper introduction. What do you want to know?" Marley blinked at the openness of the question. Part of her had feared he'd remain guarded, but here he was inviting conversation. "Well," she began, choosing her words carefully. "The tabloids call you a recluse. But you don't seem antisocial. Were you always private, or did something happen that pushed you into the shadows?" The lines around his eyes tightened slightly, hinting at old memories. "It's partly my personality. I value my space and detest the sensationalism that surrounds wealth. My parents were high-profile, constantly in the public eye, and I saw how that stress eroded their peace. They died young, leaving me to manage the family's corporate empire. Since then, I've tried to keep a low profile, focusing on philanthropic efforts rather than lavish displays. The media can't sensationalize what they barely glimpse, or at least that was my hope." Her heart softened at that. She imagined the weight of losing his parents and inheriting a vast business empire. "That's understandable," she said quietly. "So you turned to discreet philanthropy instead of flaunting your name?" A faint, rueful smile touched his lips. "I suppose so. Though ironically, my name still carries enough weight that any slip can become a headline. Hence my caution. That's why this forced marriage fiasco is a nightmare, it threatens the privacy I've fought to maintain." Before she could respond, the waitress returned with Marley's pastry and water. They fell silent, thanking her softly, and Marley took a small bite of the croissant, finding it warm and buttery. She realized her appetite had faded under her nerves, but she forced herself to eat to keep her strength up. They resumed in hushed tones once alone again, turning the conversation to Marley's background. He asked about her life before joining the charity, and she recounted growing up in a tight-knit family raised by her aunt and uncle after her parents passed away in a car accident. She spoke of her passion for art education, how she believed it could transform children's creativity in confidence. He listened intently, occasionally asking a gentle question. With each exchange, they navigated from impersonal facts to subtle glimpses of who they were beyond the facade. Marley found herself intrigued by Ethan's quiet sense of empathy, something she hadn't expected from a so-called reclusive billionaire. Even more unsettling was the sense of comfort that crept over her, like conversing with a partner rather than a near stranger forced into her orbit by inexplicable circumstances. She recalled the word wife scrawled on the marriage certificate and felt a jolt of conflicting emotions. Finally, their cups nearly empty, Ethan checked his watch. I hate to break this up, but I'm due at a meeting with potential investors. I suspect you have commitments, too. She nodded, remembering Deborah's caution not to be absent for too long. Yes, I need to finalize a few donation proposals. Another day, another opportunity to sell our mission. He stood and waited for her to gather her things. Before I go, he said in a low voice, I wanted to mention I've arranged for additional security near your charity's local office, nothing invasive, just discreet observation. If whoever orchestrated this fiasco tries to target you or the organization, they'll run into a few unexpected obstacles. Marley's eyes widened. That's actually reassuring. Thank you. Deborah would appreciate it if she knew, though I won't mention it openly unless necessary. Ethan offered a subtle shrug. I prefer caution. No one's threatened us yet, but that could change if they realize we're looking into them. Together, they left the cafe, stepping out into the chilly morning air. Traffic had picked up, and people bustled along the sidewalks. Marley zipped her coat, feeling the crisp breeze nibble at her cheeks. For a moment, they lingered by the cafe's entrance, neither eager to part ways. The city's noise seemed to fade as they exchanged one final look, an acknowledgement that whatever bound them was more complex than a contract they hadn't signed in their right minds. I'll let you know if I find anything in my phone logs or old emails, Marley said, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. We should probably meet again soon, maybe tomorrow. Even if we don't have new leads, we can strategize. Ethan's nod was decisive. Agreed. One step at a time. If something urgent arises, call me immediately. And watch your back, until we know who's behind this, caution is our best defense. Her heart warmed at his concern, though she reminded herself not to read too much into it. You do the same, she replied gently. I'll see you soon, Ethan. With a final nod, he turned and melded into the flow of pedestrians, that tall frame and purposeful stride still managing to stand out. Marley exhaled, letting the swirl of city life wash over her. She felt a twinge of reluctance as she watched him vanish around the corner. It was absurd, clinging to the presence of someone she barely knew. Yet, for all their wariness, each new conversation revealed flickers of genuine connection. Reorienting herself, Marley reminded her mind and heart that their alliance was founded on necessity. She had a cause to champion and an identity puzzle to solve, neither of which left room for romantic fantasies about the man who might be her legal husband. Straightening her shoulders, she set off in the opposite direction, determined to focus on the day's tasks, and on the promise that, step by careful step, they would uncover the truth of who forced them into this so-called marriage and why it was orchestrated on the cusp of Valentine's Day. But as she walked, she couldn't entirely shake the sense that the more she learned of Ethan Blackwell's quiet determination and thoughtful eyes, the harder it might be to finalize an annulment, assuming, of course, they ever found a way to extricate themselves from the tangle of secrets that bound them. Marley spent the rest of the morning diving into her organization's administrative records with a fervor that surprised even herself. She set up shop in a quiet corner of the hotel's makeshift office space, which had been arranged by the event's organizers for charities to handle paperwork and donor outreach. A few other representatives came and went, making phone calls or updating spreadsheets. Marley, however, focused on searching every digital calendar entry and scanning old email threads. If there was any remote chance that Raina Green or a suspicious scheduling note had slipped into her charity system, she was determined to find it. Hours passed with little reward. She discovered the usual roster of prospective donors and philanthropic mixers, but no sign of an alias that might match the mysterious Raina or any undisclosed trip to Nevada. At last, her eyes aching from staring at the screen, Marley shut her laptop and leaned back with a sigh. Each dead end only fueled her uneasy suspicion that the orchestrators of this marriage had taken pains to avoid leaving a digital trace. A knock at the doorframe drew her attention. Deborah stood there, scanning a small stack of papers. She offered Marley a tentative smile and stepped inside. "You've been holed up here all morning. Everything all right?" Marley managed a faint grin, pushing away the swirl of frustration. "I'm surviving. Just combing through old files, seeing if anyone slipped in an appointment under a fake name. So far, no luck." Deborah nodded, eyes flicking to the half-eaten muffin on the desk. "I trust you've at least eaten something more substantial." Then, lowering her voice, she added, "I'm worried about you. You've seemed on edge since this marriage certificate showed up. I just want you to know, if you need help, or if Mr. Blackwell tries anything shady, I'll back you up." Touched by the concern, Marley shook her head. "He hasn't done anything remotely suspicious. Actually, he's been supportive, if that makes sense, considering the bizarre situation. But thanks. I promise I won't keep you in the dark." She hesitated, then asked, "Did you speak to any potential donors this morning? I'd like to follow up if there's a strong lead." Deborah's expression brightened. "Yes, actually. A couple from Maine showed interest in our literacy extension. They're in a rush to finalize decisions, so I told them you'd be available after lunch. If you can free up an hour, that'd be wonderful." Grateful for a practical task, Marley agreed and tidied up her workspace. As Deborah left, Marley's phone buzzed in her pocket, Ethan's name glowing on the screen. Her pulse flickered with anticipation as she picked up, keeping her voice low. "Any news?" she asked, skipping a formal greeting. Their alliance had grown oddly comfortable with directness. Ethan's tone was clipped, as though he was juggling multiple calls at once. "A minor development. One of my investigators located a rental car in Las Vegas tied to a credit card that might be connected to our situation. The card belongs to someone named Freya Landon, but the billing address is false. Still, it's the first tangible breadcrumb we've had. The car was rented the same day as our supposed wedding. I thought you should know." Marley's stomach fluttered at the glimmer of progress. "That's promising. Do we have any link between Freya Landon and Raina Green?" "Not yet, but we're cross-referencing. I'm leaving for a short corporate luncheon soon, and I might glean more leads after I share the intel with my attorneys. I'll keep you posted." She nodded, though he couldn't see it. "All right. Thanks for letting me know. Good luck with your luncheon." A faint pause, then Ethan added, "I was thinking, maybe tonight, after your responsibilities, we could meet again. It doesn't have to be long, but there's a place near the riverfront that's quieter than the hotel bars. We could compare notes in peace. You're not obligated, of course." Marley felt warmth stir beneath her collar, an unwelcome flicker of something that felt suspiciously close to anticipation. "That sounds good. I'll text once I finish with the main couple. Probably around 8, if that works." "Perfect. I'll text you the address." He lingered a moment as though wanting to say more, then ended the call with a cordial goodbye. Setting the phone down, Marley exhaled, torn between relief at the small lead and the undeniable tension of seeing Ethan again in a more personal setting. She had to remind herself that everything they did was for the sake of unraveling the forced wedding. Yet she couldn't fully deny that she found something reassuring in his calm presence, especially when faced with a labyrinth of unknowns. The afternoon flew by. Marley pitched the charity's literacy extension to the couple from Maine, grateful to discover they were deeply impressed with the cost-effectiveness and real-world impact. If half their enthusiasm translated into actual donation, her charity would be significantly closer to its funding goal. Energized by that success, she thanked them profusely and promised to follow up with additional materials. Deborah, hovering nearby, raised her eyebrows in pleased surprise. Perhaps it was the best piece of news the team had gotten in a while. By 7:30, the day's events wound down. Marley freshened up in her hotel room, choosing a simple blouse and jeans under a worn coat rather than the more formal attire demanded by the day's schedule. She told Deborah she was meeting a friend for a casual dinner, deftly omitting the details of who that friend might be. While she trusted Deborah, the swirl of rumors that might erupt if people realized she spent her evenings with Ethan Blackwell was a risk she didn't want to take. By 7:45, she was out the door, phone in hand, checking the address Ethan had texted. The location turned out to be a modest bistro perched near the city's riverfront district, an area known for scenic walks and quieter vibes compared to the central downtown bustle. The night air carried a nip, and Marley breathed in the faint tang of water as she walked along a winding path illuminated by lampposts. She spotted Ethan near a low brick wall overlooking the river, hands in his pockets, face turned toward the softly rippling water. He looked pensive, perhaps as deep in thought as she felt these days. He noticed her approach and offered a small smile. "I hope the directions weren't confusing. This place can be tricky to find if you're not used to the area." She shook her head, returning the smile. "I managed. It's lovely here, serene." A pause settled, the rushing hush of the water bridging the silence. Then Ethan nodded toward the bistro's entrance, a softly lit doorway framed by climbing ivy. "Shall we head inside? I've reserved a corner table. We can talk without worrying about prying ears." Marley followed him in, greeted by the bistro's warm, candlelit interior. A cheery hostess led them to a table in a snug alcove. The ambience was relaxed, with quiet music and a handful of other patrons scattered about, each seemingly absorbed in their own conversations. Once they were seated, Ethan ordered tea for both of them, and Marley added a small plate of bread and spreads, her appetite piqued by the comforting smell of baked dough. When the waitress departed, Ethan leaned in, voice just above a murmur. "My team found a bit more on Freya Landon's credit card usage. She apparently made multiple purchases at a florist, a specialized stationery shop, and a wedding supply rental place. All within a 24-hour period in Vegas, on the exact date of our alleged wedding." Marley felt a chill skitter across her arms. So this might be the person who arranged the entire ceremony: flowers, stationery for the invitations or the certificate, maybe even a wedding arch rental. It's too detailed to be a random coincidence. He nodded grimly. "Exactly. The problem is, the florist described Freya as a short brunette with a distinctive accent, maybe Eastern European. She was in a hurry, didn't linger to chat. But no mention of Reina or us specifically." They paused as the waitress set down 2 steaming teapots and a platter of bread with herb butter. Marley poured her tea, stirring in a bit of sugar, her mind racing. "So we have Reina Green from the hotel, and Freya Landon from the wedding supply shops. Possibly 2 different aliases for the same person, or 2 accomplices working together." She frowned, clasping her hands around the cup. If they went to such lengths, this marriage was planned meticulously. That suggests a precise motive. Not a haphazard joke. Ethan sipped his tea, eyes narrowed in thought. "We're inching closer to the heart of it, but still in the dark about the why. I'm starting to suspect they intended to drag me into a scandal involving a random woman, no offense, hoping to blackmail me, except we discovered the certificate too soon. Or, it could be something more elaborate." Marley bristled slightly at the idea of being a mere random woman, though she recognized his meaning. "It's no offense if it's the truth," she said gently. "I'm not exactly a socialite. But if they wanted to blackmail you, why not strike the moment the record was filed? Why the delay? Unless something disrupted their plan, or they're waiting for an opportune moment. Ethan's mouth tightened. Possibly. Or they miscalculated how quickly we'd notice the certificate. Still, it's been over a week, and not a single blackmail attempt. It's baffling. He exhaled, turning a pensive gaze on her. What if it's not about money at all? Could there be a personal vendetta aimed at me, or at you, that's more about humiliation or revenge? Have you upset anyone in your professional circle? Marley considered. No one that I'm aware of. My organization's mostly philanthropic types, not cutthroat. I can't see a teacher or volunteer going to such extremes. And personally, I'm fairly drama-free. Unless there's an old friend with a massive grudge I'm oblivious to. They fell silent again, each lost in speculation. The bistro's candlelight played across Ethan's thoughtful features, highlighting the faint lines of weariness on his brow. Marley found herself fighting a wave of empathy, wanting to brush away the tension from his face, an impulse far too intimate for their precarious situation. Instead, she busied herself breaking off a piece of bread and buttering it, relieved to have something tangible to do with her hands. At length, Ethan reached across the table, resting his palm near hers without quite touching. Despite how tangled this is, I'm glad we're not tackling it alone. His voice was low, genuine. I realize we're each other's only real ally in this. Marley's pulse thudded. The subtle warmth in his words reminded her of how easy it was to talk to him, to trust him in a predicament so improbable. She forced a smile. I feel the same. Thank you for everything. I know you could have just thrown me a stack of legal disclaimers and walked away. A faint, wry grin tugged his lips. I've never been one to turn my back on a crisis, especially one that touches me personally. Besides, from what I can see, you're worth having as an ally. Her cheeks heated slightly, and she hastily sipped her tea to disguise her fluster. The conversation drifted to lighter topics then, the best ways to engage youth in art, Ethan's more fulfilling philanthropic encounters, even a story from Marley about an impromptu puppet show she once orchestrated for a group of bored kids waiting for parents after a workshop. They laughed quietly, a momentary reprieve from the weight of conspiracies and false marriages. By the time they finished, the bistro had begun to fill with a handful of other patrons, and the hush of their table felt more pronounced. Ethan signaled for the check, and Marley half-heartedly tried to pay her share, but he insisted it was the least he could do. As they rose to leave, neither seemed eager to step outside into the cold that awaited. Let me walk you back, he offered, a note of concern in his tone. It's not too far, but I'd feel better knowing you got to the hotel safely. Marley hesitated, aware that strolling along with him in the evening might appear intimate if any colleague spotted them. But the sincerity in his expression overrode her caution. All right, she agreed. Just to the hotel entrance. The night air nipped at her cheeks as they left the bistro, footsteps echoing on the sidewalk. Streetlights cast elongated shadows, and the faint hum of distant traffic underscored the quiet closeness between them. For a moment, neither spoke, simply matching each other's pace. She looked up, noticing how the buildings framed a slice of the sky where a waxing moon glowed. Eventually, she broke the silence. If tomorrow yields more leads on Freya or Reyna, let me know. I'll keep digging on my end, see if your investigators missed any angle with the charity's contacts. Ethan nodded, hands in his coat pockets. I will. And if anything out of the ordinary happens, call me. Even if it's just a strange phone call or email. We're dealing with professionals, apparently, so caution is key. They turned a corner, and the hotel's facade came into view, its windows gleaming. Marley braced herself for the end of their encounter, this fleeting bubble of near friendship about to pop the instant she stepped through the lobby doors and resumed the role of a modest charity worker. She felt a pang at how quickly she'd grown used to sharing her day with him, despite the absurd circumstances that had forced them together. Stopping in front of the revolving doors, she offered a light smile. Thank you for tonight. I guess we'll see what tomorrow brings. Ethan stepped nearer, lowering his voice. Yes. Anne. Marley. He hesitated, then continued more softly. I know we're trying to keep everything under wraps, but if you ever feel overwhelmed, truly, call me. We're in this mess together. Warmth unfurled in her chest, battling the sense of vulnerability that threatened to surface. I appreciate that, she murmured. Same goes for you. We might not be official partners in anything beyond confusion, but I'm here if you need an ear. For a beat, she thought he might close the distance, perhaps to offer an encouraging squeeze of her hand, but his posture remained respectful. With a final incline of his head, he murmured a quiet, good night, and retreated into the night's dim hush, footsteps fading along the sidewalk. Marley inhaled slowly, blinking away the peculiar rush of disappointment at his departure. Then she pushed through the hotel's doors, returning to the whir of the lobby's central air and the polished floors that reflected her uncertain expression back at her. Her thoughts churned long after she'd retreated to her room, mind pinned on Ethan's sincerity and the small steps they'd taken toward unraveling the puzzle. More than once, she wondered how a sham marriage, created by unknown hands, could foster an unspoken camaraderie that felt unsettlingly real. Lying awake, she stared at the faint patterns of light dancing on the ceiling, pondering how close they were to a discovery that might either free them from this bizarre entanglement, or bind them more tightly than either had anticipated. Marley awoke the following morning to an urgent text from Ethan, the screen of her phone glowing with a short but alarming message: "We need to talk now. My sweet, 8 a.m. A jolt of apprehension shot through her, dispelling any lingering drowsiness. She rushed through her morning routine, mind reeling with every possible scenario that could have demanded such urgency. Had his investigators finally uncovered the identity of Raina Green or Freya Landon? Or had the mastermind behind their unwanted marriage attempted a move that Ethan needed to discuss in person? She found his suite door ajar when she arrived, revealing a tense hush inside. He stood near the window, gazing out at the city skyline with folded arms, shoulders rigid. A half-empty cup of coffee rested on the side table, its steam dissipating into the still air. When Marley slipped inside, quietly shutting the door, he turned, revealing an expression that wavered between triumph and concern. Sorry to summon you so abruptly, he began, voice taut. We finally have a major lead. My investigators did a deeper dive on the name Freya Landon. It's not an alias, she exists, and she has a record of involvement in clandestine events, including forging legal documents for private clients. We traced her payments to a foreign bank account. There's more, they discovered email correspondences on a server in Nevada, referencing a plan to lure me into a marriage scenario for future leverage. Marley's pulse hammered. She stepped forward, setting her satchel on the armchair. So it was blackmail all along. Then why hasn't anyone come forward with demands? Ethan exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. It seems something disrupted their timetable. The correspondences indicate they plan to reveal this scandal at a high-profile business summit next week, cornering me into paying hush money. But because we found the marriage certificate early and began poking around, they backed off. Possibly they're waiting for a calmer moment to pounce, or re-evaluating the risk. My team also identified a potential connection to a competitor of mine named Brandon Keys. He's had financial disputes with me in the past. The emails mention a backer providing funds for Freya's operation. Marley's nails bit into her palm as she processed this. So a competitor financed a scheme to marry you to a random woman, me, and then blackmail you for something in return? That's insidious. But where do I fit in? Why me specifically? His eyes held sympathy. Freya's notes suggest she scoured philanthropic rosters, looking for someone with a clean reputation, a modest background, likely to be stunned into compliance. She concluded that if you discovered yourself legally tied to me, you'd be too overwhelmed to react swiftly, making it easier for them to manipulate the scenario. They even tested forging your signature on simpler forms, refining the technique for the wedding license. It's horrifyingly elaborate. Marley shuddered at the invasion of her privacy. So they literally chose me at random, because I'd be an easy victim. That's vile. She sank onto the arm of the sofa, a heaviness dragging at her limbs. I guess that means you and I never actually went to Nevada. They used my basic personal info, your status, and the forger's skills to create a legal illusion. Ethan nodded. Yes, plus the clerk was bribed. There never was a legitimate hotel check-in under our real names. Freya staged everything, paying staff to claim they saw us. The county records were tricked by official-looking IDs and the clerk's false testimony. That's how they bypassed normal security checks. All of it points to a bigger operation than we guessed. A rush of relief mingled with anger in Marley's chest. At least she hadn't lost her memory or been physically coerced. Still, the knowledge she'd been singled out as a pawn made her fists clench. What do we do now? Present this evidence to the authorities? Cancel the marriage via annulment immediately? Or should we wait for them to strike, so we can catch them red-handed? Ethan glanced at the coffee cup, then back to her, concern etched in his features. My legal team advises we gather the final threads of proof, bank transfers, confessions from the bribed clerk, then go to law enforcement. We're close. By tomorrow, we might have enough to take down both Freya and her backer, presumably Brandon Keyes. That said, they warned me to be careful. If Keyes suspects we know everything, he might lash out or target you more directly. Marley rubbed her arms, a chill prickling her skin despite the sweet's warmth. I won't hide. My charity's nearly at its funding goal, and I still have responsibilities here. But I'll stay alert, keep my phone on at all times. If they approach me with threats, I'll document every word. Ethan crossed the space between them, laying a hand lightly on her shoulder. The gesture brimmed with unspoken worry. I promise I won't let them harm you. A security detail is on standby. And once the authorities step in, this fiasco can end. With enough evidence, the county clerk will grant an annulment swiftly. Unless, of course, you want. He broke off, color faintly touching his cheeks, as though unsure how to finish. A strange hush settled between them. Marley's mind flicked to the emotional closeness they'd developed in this short, tumultuous span. An annulment was logical, the rightful path after a forced marriage. Yet she couldn't deny the twinge of sorrow that thought triggered, a realization that once they severed this bizarre bond, they might walk away from each other's lives entirely. She exhaled, voice low. It's for the best, I know. Once we clear our names, we'll both want to move on. And that's how it should be. His hand lingered on her shoulder before sliding away, leaving a tingling ghost of warmth. Right, he said softly. We never consented to any of this. It was inflicted on us. A pause. But that doesn't erase what we learned about each other in the process, does it? Marley's heart constricted, a swirl of conflicting emotions tightening her chest. No, it doesn't. And I'm grateful for that, as odd as it sounds. We wouldn't have met otherwise, not in a real way. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan cleared his throat, returning to practicalities. I'll coordinate with my investigators, see if they can corner Freya or that crooked clerk into a direct confession. If everything goes well, we can present it to the district attorney. Will you be able to stay in town a bit longer, until it's resolved? I know your charity obligations are nearly done, but I hate the idea of you traveling while this is still volatile. Marley nodded. I'll let Deborah know I need an extra day or two. She'll be curious, but I'll figure out a good excuse. She studied his face, searching for any sign of doubt. I guess we should keep playing it cool in public, continue the facade that we're just acquaintances. Then once everything is out in the open, we can sign the annulment forms and move on. He didn't immediately reply. Outside the window, the morning sun glinted off distant skyscrapers, painting the suite in shifting light. Eventually, Ethan inclined his head in agreement. Yes. We'll do that. Though I might invite you to a formal dinner after. To celebrate our freedom, maybe. And also because I wouldn't mind sharing a meal without the specter of conspiracy looming. Her heart thudded at the unexpected invitation, a flicker of hope sneaking past the fortress of logic. I'd like that, she whispered, hardly trusting her own voice. They exchanged a small smile, a fragile pact forged in a fleeting moment. Just then, Ethan's phone buzzed. Snatching it up, he answered tersely, the tension on his face returning. Marley braced herself, awaiting more developments, while he stepped aside to converse in a clipped tone. After a minute or two, he hung up, eyes sharpened with purpose. That was my lead investigator. They've located Freya Landon's hideout, an apartment in a rundown area of the city. She's been spotted leaving in a hurry, possibly sensing the noose tightening. They're asking if I want to involve the police right away or stake it out for further evidence. Marley sucked in a breath. This could be it, the break we need. Her pulse kicked up a notch. If we corner her, we can uncover Brandon Key's role. Ethan nodded decisively. I'll instruct them to bring the authorities in carefully. If all goes well, by tonight we may have enough for charges. He softened his tone. In which case, you and I can end this legal farce. That might even happen tomorrow, depending on how quickly the courts process it. She swallowed, steadying her voice. That's good news. I'll be relieved to have it officially undone. We'll both be free. He allowed a short, humorless laugh. Free of an obligation we never asked for, yes. But if you don't mind me saying, free is a complicated word here. Marley's gaze dropped to the floor. She understood his meaning all too well. The forced marriage was an injustice, a false tie. Yet in dismantling it, they'd also lose the impetus that had brought them into each other's daily lives, forging a bond that felt, ironically, a little too real. Uncertain how to respond, she simply nodded. Let's do this, she said at last. Let's finish the puzzle. Ethan gave her a determined look, then guided her to the door. The hallway stretched ahead, its plush carpet muffling their footsteps, as they left the suite together. Their parting outside the elevator was brisk but charged with an undercurrent of anticipation, one more day, perhaps, until truth shattered the dark puzzle that had bound them. Then, after that, Marley tried not to dwell on the possibility that closure would also bring goodbye. They separated with the understanding that the next call might be the final piece, the moment Freya, and likely Brandon Keyes, were unmasked, the marriage license exposed as a grand forgery with official stamps and unsuspecting clerks as pawns. Marley told herself to focus on the endgame, her own name cleared, Ethan's privacy restored, their unasked-for vows nullified. But as she rode the elevator back down, phone clutched tight, she couldn't entirely banish the twist of sorrow. Because freeing themselves from a forced bond also meant relinquishing the tentative closeness they'd built, no matter how accidental or strangely sweet it had become. By midday, she was amid the charity's final wrap-up sessions, trying to concentrate on donors who wanted last-minute clarifications. Deborah flitted in with news that the main fundraising goal had been surpassed, thanks to a few large pledges from impressed attendees. Normally, Marley would be elated by this victory, yet her mind remained overshadowed by the looming confrontation. She left the session early to pace her hotel room, awaiting any word from Ethan or his investigators. She replayed their conversation in the suite, the earnestness in his eyes when he admitted this fiasco had shaken him more than he'd ever let on publicly. As evening crept closer, Marley's phone buzzed again, a message from Ethan stating, Freya in custody. Brandon Keyes implicated. Papers being processed. I'll update soon. She sank onto the edge of her bed, relief and a pang of something indescribable washing over her. It was nearly done. Their forced union was on the brink of dissolution. The tension that had haunted her for days should have drained away, replaced by triumphant calm. Yet her heart clenched at the knowledge that they would soon be free to walk entirely separate paths. A half-hour later, Ethan called with the full rundown. Freya had confessed to forging the marriage license under Key's orders, with the intention to blackmail Ethan at a high-profile business summit. She was prepared to testify for a lighter sentence, ensuring the entire scheme was exposed. Once the district attorney reviewed the documents, the court would invalidate the fraudulent license. By tomorrow afternoon, possibly the next day at worst, Marley and Ethan would be legally unbound.